I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Not until the night I stood in the hallway of my father's house at 2 in the morning, staring at the basement door that had locked itself from the outside while I slept. My name is Margaret, and I'm 73 years old now. What I'm about to tell you happened 5 years ago, but I remember every detail like it was yesterday. Some memories fade with time. Others burn themselves into your mind so deeply that you taste them every time you close your eyes. If you love honest stories, stay with me and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, which city or state. I'd love to know who's out there, listening to an old woman's strange tale. My father died in March. Heart attack. Quick and painless, the doctors said, as if that made it easier. He was 89 and had lived in that house for 47 years. It was a beautiful old Victorian on the edge of Portland, Maine, with tall windows and a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun. My husband Richard and I had been renting a small apartment across town for the past decade, ever since we downsized. When Dad passed, it seemed natural to move into his house. It was paid off, spacious, and filled with memories of better days. Are you sure about this? Richard asked me the day we got the keys. He stood in the driveway, looking up at the 3 stories of weathered blue paint and white trim. It's a lot of house for just the 2 of us. It's home, I told him. And I meant it. I'd grown up in that house. I knew every creaking floorboard, every loose doorknob, every window that stuck in the summer humidity. Or at least, I thought I did. We moved in on a Saturday in late April. The weather was perfect, one of those rare spring days in Maine when the air smells like pine and possibility. Our son David and his wife helped us carry boxes up the front steps. My daughter Claire flew in from Chicago for the weekend, claiming she wanted to help but spending most of her time wandering through rooms and crying softly when she thought no one was looking. Dad had been her favorite. He'd always had more patience with her than I did. The first week passed normally. We unpacked boxes, rearranged furniture, argued about whether to keep Dad's old recliner in the living room. Richard wanted to donate it. I insisted we keep it. I won, mostly because he could see I wasn't ready to let go of everything at once. The house felt different without Dad in it, emptier somehow, even though we'd filled it with our own belongings. But it still smelled like him. Old Spice and coffee and the lemon oil he used on the wood furniture. The basement had always been Dad's domain. He'd spent hours down there in his workshop, building bookshelves and fixing broken lamps and doing all the small projects that kept him busy after Mom died. I'd been down there a handful of times since we moved in, mostly to sort through his tools and decide what to keep. It was unfinished, with concrete floors and exposed beams, lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There were boxes of old photographs, crates of Christmas decorations, and Dad's workbench covered in sawdust and half-finished projects he'd never complete. The door to the basement was at the end of the first-floor hallway, just past the kitchen. It was solid oak, heavy, with an old-fashioned sliding bolt lock on the outside. I'd never thought much about that lock. Dad had installed it decades ago, back when my brother Tommy and I were small, to keep us from tumbling down the steep stairs in the dark. Tommy died in Vietnam in 1971. I was the only child left to remember things like that. It was our 8th night in the house when it first happened. I woke up around 2 in the morning needing to use the bathroom. Richard was snoring softly beside me, dead to the world as usual. I slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway in my nightgown, not bothering to turn on the lights because I knew the path by heart. The bathroom was at the other end of the hall, past the basement door. When I came back, I noticed something odd. The basement door's bolt lock was engaged. The thick metal bar was slid firmly into place, securing the door from the hallway side. I stopped and stared at it, my hand still on the bathroom doorknob. I knew, absolutely knew, that lock had been open when I'd gone to bed. I'd walked past that door before turning in for the night, and the bolt had been in its unlocked position, pulled back against the doorframe. My first thought was that Richard had gotten up and locked it for some reason. But when I went back to our bedroom, he was still snoring in exactly the same position, his reading glasses on the nightstand where he'd left them. He hadn't moved. I stood in our bedroom doorway for a long moment, my heart beating a little faster than it should. Then I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was 73 years old. Too old to be frightened by a locked door in my own house. Obviously, I'd been mistaken about the lock's position. My memory wasn't what it used to be. I'd probably just forgotten that I'd locked it myself earlier in the evening. I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, over coffee, I mentioned it casually to Richard. "Did you lock the basement door last night?" He looked at me over the rim of his mug, his bushy white eyebrows raised. The basement? No. Why would I? No reason, I said. I just noticed it was locked when I got up in the night. Thought maybe you'd done it. Haven't touched that door since we moved in, he said, and went back to his crossword puzzle. I let it drop. But the next night, before bed, I made a point of checking the basement door. The bolt was unlocked, pulled back flush against the frame. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the bolt, making absolutely certain of what I was seeing. Then I went to bed. At 2:17 a.m., according to the clock on my nightstand, I woke up again. No particular reason this time. Just that sudden awareness that pulls you out of sleep for no reason you can name. Richard was snoring. The house was quiet. And I had the strangest, most unsettling feeling that something was wrong. I got out of bed and walked to the hallway. The basement door's bolt was locked. Slid firmly into place, just like the night before. My mouth went dry. I stood there in the dark hallway, staring at that bolt, and felt something cold move through my chest. This time I knew. I knew with absolute certainty that the door had been unlocked when I went to bed. I'd checked it specifically. I'd stood right here and looked at it. I walked closer, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The bolt was an old design, the kind you had to slide firmly to engage. It took deliberate force. It couldn't have moved on its own. Someone had locked this door. But Richard was asleep. And we were the only two people in the house. I reached out and touched the bolt. The metal was cold under my fingers. For reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't unlock it. Instead, I backed away slowly and returned to bed, where I lay awake until dawn, listening to Richard snore and trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The next day, I said nothing to Richard. I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind. But I couldn't stop thinking about that door. After he left for his morning walk, I went down to the basement with a flashlight, even though the sun was shining. I wanted to look around, to see if anything seemed disturbed or out of place. Everything looked exactly as it had the last time I'd been down there. Dad's workbench. The boxes. The Christmas decorations. The concrete floor was dusty but undisturbed. No footprints except the ones I'd left on previous visits. Nothing seemed wrong. And yet I felt watched. I felt, absurdly, like I was intruding on something. I went back upstairs and locked the door behind me. From the outside. With the bolt. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep, waiting. At 2:13 a.m., I got up and checked the door. Still locked, just as I'd left it. Relief flooded through me. See, I told myself. Nothing mysterious. Just an old woman's overactive imagination. But 2 nights later, it happened again. I'd left the door unlocked intentionally, wanting to test my theory. At 2:20 a.m., I woke up and checked. Locked. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding, and felt fear settle into my bones like winter cold. Something was in this house with us. Something that wanted that basement door locked every night. Something that moved through these rooms while we slept and did this one deliberate, impossible thing. And I had no idea what to do about it. I want to tell you something about fear. Real fear, not the kind you feel watching a scary movie or riding a roller coaster. Real fear is quiet. It doesn't make you scream. It makes you very, very still. It makes you think carefully about every word you say and every person you tell, because once you speak something terrifying out loud, it becomes real in a way it wasn't before. That's where I was in those early days, trapped between knowing something impossible was happening and being too afraid to admit it, even to myself. Let me catch you up on where we were. It was our 3rd week in Dad's house. The basement door had locked itself from the outside 4 times now, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. Always when both Richard and I were in bed. I'd started checking it obsessively before sleep, making sure the bolt was unlocked, and then finding it secured hours later. I hadn't told Richard about the pattern yet. I didn't know how to explain something I couldn't explain to myself. On the 5th occurrence, I decided to test something. That evening, after Richard went to bed, I took a small piece of clear tape and placed it across the bolt and the doorframe, creating a seal. If the bolt moved, the tape would tear. It was something concrete, something that would prove to me I wasn't imagining things or sleepwalking or slowly losing my grip on reality. I checked the tape 3 times before I finally climbed into bed at 11 o'clock. It was intact each time. I lay awake for as long as I could, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. But eventually, exhaustion won. I fell asleep sometime after midnight. I woke at 2:34 a.m. to the sound of Richard getting up to use the bathroom. His movements roused me just enough to remember the tape. As soon as he came back to bed, I slipped out and went to check the door. The tape was torn, hanging in two pieces, one on the doorframe and one stuck to the bolt. And the bolt was locked. I stood there shaking, my hand over my mouth to keep from making any sound. The tape didn't lie. Something had physically moved that bolt. Something with enough force to slide the heavy metal bar and break the seal I'd created. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't memory problems or sleepwalking, or any of the rational explanations I'd been desperately clinging to. Margaret. Richard's voice came from behind me, groggy with sleep. What are you doing out here? I spun around, my heart jumping. He stood in the bedroom doorway in his pajamas, squinting at me in the dim light from the nightlight we kept plugged in near the bathroom. I started, then stopped. What could I say? I was just checking something. Checking what? It's the middle of the night. He walked toward me, and I saw the moment his eyes focused on the basement door behind me. Is something wrong with the door? No, I said quickly. Too quickly. I just thought I heard a noise. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to decide whether to push the issue. Finally, he just sighed. Come back to bed. You're going to catch cold out here in your nightgown. I followed him back to the bedroom, but I didn't sleep. I lay there until the sun came up, thinking about that torn tape and wondering what in God's name was happening in my father's house. The next morning, I called Claire in Chicago. I didn't tell her about the door, not yet, but I asked her about Dad's last few months. Had he mentioned anything strange? Had he seemed worried or upset about anything? Mom, we've been over this, Claire said, her voice gentle but tired. She'd been fielding my questions for weeks now, trying to help me process Dad's death. He was fine. Happy even. He'd just finished building that bookshelf for Mrs. Henderson down the street. He was planning a fishing trip with his buddy Frank. There was nothing wrong. Did he ever talk about the house? About anything unusual happening? There was a pause. Unusual how? I scrambled for something that wouldn't sound insane. I don't know. Strange sounds. Problems with the doors or windows. Anything. Mom. Claire's voice shifted, taking on that careful, concerned tone that adult children use when they're worried about their aging parents. Are you okay? Is something going on? I'm fine, Elid. Just trying to get the house sorted. There's so much of his stuff to go through. We talked for a few more minutes, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. When we hung up, I felt more alone than before. I couldn't tell her. She'd think I was having some kind of breakdown, seeing problems that weren't there because I was grieving. Maybe I was. That night, I tried something different. I set up my phone on a shelf in the hallway, positioning it to record the basement door. I started the video at midnight, and made sure the battery was fully charged. If something moved that bolt, I was going to capture it. Richard asked me what I was doing. I told him I thought I'd seen a mouse, and wanted to figure out where it was getting in. He accepted this without question, and went to bed. I joined him an hour later, after I'd triple-checked that the camera was recording, and the door was unlocked. I woke at 2:41 a.m. I don't know what woke me, just that suddenly I was alert, my heart racing, every sense sharp. The house was completely silent. Richard was asleep beside me, and I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that something had just happened in the hallway. I got up slowly and walked to where I'd left my phone. The screen was black. Not recording. I picked it up with shaking hands and tried to access the video. The phone was completely dead, battery drained to zero. Even though it had been at full charge 2.5 hours earlier. The basement door was locked. I stood there holding my dead phone, and I started to cry. Not loud, heaving sobs, but silent tears that ran down my face while I tried to breathe normally. I was 73 years old. I'd lived through a war, raised 2 children, buried my mother and brother and husband's parents, and now my father. I'd survived cancer and heartbreak and every normal tragedy that comes with a long life. But this thing I couldn't see or explain or fight, was breaking something inside me. What do you want? I whispered to the empty hallway. What are you trying to tell me? The house didn't answer. It never did. But standing there in the dark, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Whatever was locking that door didn't want us to go into the basement. It was protecting something down there. Or keeping something contained. The next day, while Richard was at his weekly poker game, I went down to the basement again. This time I didn't just look around casually. I searched. I moved boxes, checked behind the old furniture Dad had stored, examined every corner and crevice I could reach. I was looking for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. A hidden room. Strange symbols. Evidence of something that shouldn't be there. What I found was worse than anything supernatural. In a box behind Dad's workbench, hidden under old tax returns from the 1990s, I discovered a stack of letters. They were addressed to my father, dated over the past 2 years, and they were all from the same person. A woman named Patricia Holloway. I didn't recognize the name. I sat on the concrete floor and read them. And with each letter, my understanding of my father shifted and cracked and reformed into something I didn't recognize. Patricia Holloway had been Dad's friend, his companion, and from what these letters suggested, possibly more than that. She wrote about dinners they'd shared, walks they'd taken, conversations that lasted until midnight. She wrote about how much she treasured his company, how he'd brought light back into her life after her husband passed away. The letters were sweet, affectionate, and they mentioned something else repeatedly. She kept asking him about our plan, and when you're going to tell them, and I know it's hard, but we deserve this happiness. The last letter was dated January 15th, 2 months before Dad died. It was different from the others. Shorter. Sadder. Robert, it said. I understand you're not ready. I understand you're afraid of how Margaret will react, how the children will see you. But I'm 76 years old. We don't have time to waste being afraid. I love you. I've loved you for 3 years now. And I'm asking you, please, let's stop hiding. Let's stop pretending. Come away with me like we talked about. Sell the house. Start fresh somewhere new. We both deserve that. I'll wait for your answer, but I can't wait forever. With all my heart, Patricia. I held that letter in my hands and felt my whole world tilt. My father had been in love. He'd been making plans to leave, to sell this house, to start a new life with someone I'd never even heard of. And he'd never told me. He'd carried this secret right up until the moment his heart gave out. And then he'd taken it with him. But why? Why hide it? I wouldn't have judged him. Mom had been gone for 12 years. He deserved companionship, love, happiness in his final years. Unless there was something about Patricia that made him keep her secret. Something he knew would upset us. I went back upstairs with those letters clutched in my hand, and I felt anger mixing with my fear. My father had secrets. This house had secrets. And somehow, these things were connected to what was happening at night, to that locked door, and whatever was trying to tell me something I was too blind or too stubborn to understand. That night, the door locked again at 2:28 a.m. But this time, when I stood in the hallway staring at it, I didn't feel afraid. I felt determined. Whatever was happening here, whatever my father had left unfinished or unsaid, I was going to find out. Even if it meant I had to face things I didn't want to face. I just didn't know yet how much worse things were going to get. You know what I've learned about truth? It's like pulling on a loose thread. You think you're just going to tidy up one small thing, but before you know it, the whole sweater is unraveling in your hands. That's what happened when I found those letters from Patricia Holloway. I thought I'd discovered my father's secret. I had no idea I'd barely scratched the surface. So there I was, 3 weeks into living in Dad's house, holding love letters from a woman whose existence had been completely hidden from me. The basement door continued its nightly ritual of locking itself. And now I had a new mystery layered on top of the first one. Were they connected? They had to be. Nothing in my life had ever happened in neat, separate compartments. Why would this be different? Richard finally noticed something was wrong with me over breakfast that Saturday. I'd been pushing scrambled eggs around my plate for 10 minutes without taking a bite. Lost in thoughts about Patricia Holloway and locked doors and what it all meant. Maggie, he said, using the nickname he'd called me since we were 18. You're not eating. You haven't been sleeping. What's going on? I looked up at him, at this man I'd been married to for 51 years, and I made a decision. Something's happening in this house. Something I can't explain. His expression shifted from concern to wariness. What do you mean something's happening? So I told him. All of it. The locked door, the tape, the phone battery draining, my certainty that something was trying to communicate with us. I watched his face as I talked, seeing him struggle between wanting to believe me and thinking I was having some kind of breakdown. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Show me, he finally said. That night we stayed up together. We sat in the living room with the lights off, waiting. At 2:15 a.m., Richard got up and checked the basement door. Unlocked, just as we'd left it. We went back to the living room. At 2:30 we checked again. Still unlocked. By 3 o'clock, Richard was looking at me with a mixture of pity and relief. Maybe it stopped, he said gently. Maybe whatever it was, it's over now. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it in the air, a tension like the stillness before a thunderstorm. The presence in this house wasn't gone. It was just waiting. I was right. The next night, I checked the door alone at 2:22 a.m. Locked. Richard was asleep, exactly as I knew he would be. Whatever was doing this had waited until he gave up watching. It wanted me to know me specifically, and it didn't want witnesses. The following Monday, while Richard was at his doctor's appointment for his annual physical, I did something I probably should have done weeks earlier. I called the local historical society and asked about the house's history. A cheerful woman named Donna answered, and seemed delighted to help. Oh, the Anderson house on Maple Street. Yes, we have quite a bit on that property. Built in 1887 by Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore. It's been through several families over the years. What would you like to know? Did anything unusual ever happen there? Any incidents? Donna was quiet for a moment. Well, there was a tragedy in 1952. Are you family? My heart started beating faster. It's my father's house. He just passed away. I'm so sorry for your loss. She paused. In 1952, a young woman died in the house. Dorothy Anderson. She was only 23. Fell down the basement stairs and broke her neck. It was ruled an accident, but there was some talk at the time. Talk about what? Her husband was questioned extensively by the police. There were rumors of marital problems, but nothing was ever proven. He sold the house 6 months later and moved away. After that, it went through a few different owners before your father bought it in 1978. Dorothy Anderson. Dead at 23, at the bottom of the basement stairs. And now, 70 years later, something was locking that basement door every night. Keeping people out. Or keeping something in. Was there anything else? I asked. Any other incidents? Not that I know of. Would you like me to send you copies of what we have? Old newspaper articles, property records, that sort of thing. I gave her my email address and thanked her. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. A woman had died here. She died at the bottom of those basement stairs, the same stairs that door led to. And now that door was being locked every single night, without fail, at almost the exact same time. The documents from Donna arrived that afternoon. I printed them out and spread them across the dining room table. There were newspaper clippings from the Portland Press-Herald, dated September 1952. Local woman dies in tragic accident. Police question husband in fall death. Anderson case closed, death ruled accidental. But it was the last article that made my blood run cold. It was from February 1953, just a small paragraph buried in the back pages. In a strange development to last year's Dorothy Anderson case, police were called to the Maple Street property last night after neighbors reported seeing lights in the basement windows. The house has been vacant since November, when Robert Anderson sold the property and left the state. Police found no signs of forced entry, and the incident is not being investigated further. Lights in the basement. In an empty house. 6 months after Dorothy Anderson died there. I sat at that table for a long time, staring at those old newspapers and feeling pieces of a puzzle click into place. But I didn't like the picture they were forming. I didn't like it at all. That evening, I made another decision. I went down to the basement while Richard was watching the news. I brought those letters from Patricia Holloway with me, along with the newspaper articles. I laid them all out on Dad's workbench, like an offering, like evidence in a case I was trying to solve. I know you're here, I said to the empty basement. I know something happened in this house, something terrible. And I think my father knew about it too. I think that's why he never sold, why he stayed all these years. But I need to understand. Please. Help me understand. The basement was silent. The single light bulb swung slightly, casting moving shadows across the concrete walls. Nothing answered me. But as I turned to go back upstairs, I saw something I'd missed before. On the underside of the stairs, carved into the wood, were initials. DA 1951. Dorothy Anderson. She'd carved her initials there, probably when the house was still new to her and her husband. When she was still young and hopeful and alive. I ran my fingers over the letters, feeling the groove she'd made with what? A pocket knife? A key? Some small tool she'd used to mark this place as hers. I'm listening, he whispered. I'm trying to hear you. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed, watching the clock, waiting for 2:20 to arrive. When it did, I got up immediately and went to the hallway. The door was still unlocked. I stood there, my hand on the bolt, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to go down into the basement right then, in the middle of the night, alone. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to do it. This was how people died in horror movies, walking into danger because something pulled them there. But I wasn't in a movie. I was a 73-year-old woman in my father's house, and something was trying to show me something important. I unlocked the door and opened it. The basement stairs descended into darkness. The light switch was at the bottom of the stairs, an inconvenient placement that Dad had always meant to change, but never got around to. I'd have to go down in the dark and feel for it. I took a deep breath and started down, counting steps the way I'd learned to do as a child. 1, 2, 3. My hand on the rail, my feet careful on each tread. 7, 8, 9. The darkness was complete, pressing against my eyes. 13, 14, 15. My hand reached the bottom of the rail. I stepped onto the concrete floor and reached for where I knew the light switch should be. My fingers found it and flipped it up. The bulb blazed to life, and I saw something that made me gasp out loud. The basement was full of flowers. Not real flowers, but drawings of them. Hundreds of them, covering every wall from floor to ceiling. Pencil sketches of roses and daisies and lilies, some crude and childlike, others detailed and beautiful. They hadn't been there before. I'd been down here just hours ago. The walls had been bare concrete. And then I blinked, and they were gone. The walls were bare again, just exposed concrete and old water stains. But I'd seen them. For just a moment. I'd seen what Dorothy Anderson had seen. What she'd maybe painted or drawn or dreamed about in this basement before she died here. I stood there shaking, and then I heard it. A sound from upstairs. The basement door slamming shut. And then the distinct sound of the bolt sliding into place. I was locked in. Have you ever been truly trapped? I don't mean stuck in traffic or held up in a long line. I mean locked in a space with no way out. Knowing that the only person who can free you is asleep and won't wake up for hours. That's where I was, 73 years old, standing at the bottom of the basement stairs in my father's house at 2:30 in the morning, listening to the echo of that bolt sliding into place above me. My first instinct was panic. Pure, animal panic that made my chest tight and my breath come in short gasps. I grabbed the rail and started up the stairs as fast as my old knees would allow, calling out for Richard even though I knew he wouldn't hear me. Our bedroom was at the other end of the house, and he slept like the dead even without his hearing aids in. I reached the door and pounded on it. Richard. Richard, I'm locked in. My voice sounded thin and frightened even to my own ears. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening for any sound of movement from the other side. Nothing. Just the settling sounds of an old house at night. I tried the door handle, knowing it was useless. The bolt was on the outside. There was no way to unlock it from where I stood. I was well and truly trapped, and whatever had locked me in here wanted me to be. That thought made me stop pounding and step back from the door. Whatever had locked me in. I'd been so focused on the practical problem of being trapped that I hadn't let myself think about the impossible fact that something had just closed and locked a heavy door with no human hand touching it. Something that wanted me here, alone, in the place where Dorothy Anderson had died. I turned slowly and looked back down the stairs. The basement was exactly as it had been before, just concrete and shadows and Dad's old belongings. No flowers on the walls. No visible presence. But I could feel it now. That sense of being watched that I'd been ignoring for weeks. It was stronger down here. Focused. All right, I said aloud, and my voice steadied as I said it. Fear was useless right now. If something wanted to show me something, fighting it wouldn't help. I'm here. I'm listening. What is it you need me to understand? The basement was silent. I walked back down the stairs, my hand trailing on the rail, and moved toward Dad's workbench. The newspaper articles and Patricia's letters were still where I'd left them, spread across the dusty surface. I picked up the article about Dorothy Anderson's death, and read it again in the harsh light of the hanging bulb. Police report that Mrs. Anderson was found at approximately 3 a.m. by her husband, Robert Anderson, who stated he woke to use the bathroom and found her missing from their bed. He discovered her at the bottom of the basement stairs with fatal injuries to her head and neck. Mr. Anderson claims he has no knowledge of why his wife would have gone to the basement in the middle of the night. Robert Anderson. The same first name as my father. Was that just coincidence? It had to be. Dad hadn't bought this house until 1978, 26 years after Dorothy died. He'd never mentioned knowing anything about its history. But then again, he'd never mentioned Patricia Holloway either, and she'd been a huge part of his life for 3 years. I set down the article and looked around the basement with new eyes. What was I missing? What had Dad known that he'd never told me? I walked slowly around the space, examining everything. The boxes of Christmas decorations. The old furniture. The tools on the pegboard above the workbench. The concrete floor with its cracks and stains. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, hidden behind a stack of paint cans, there was a section of the concrete floor that looked different. Newer. The color was slightly off, the texture not quite matching the rest of the floor. It was maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, an irregular rectangle that someone had tried to blend in but hadn't quite succeeded. I moved the paint cans aside, my heart hammering. This was it. This was what I was meant to find. I knelt down on the cold concrete, ignoring the protest from my knees, and ran my hands over the newer section. It was definitely concrete, but it had been poured separately from the original floor, probably decades after the house was built. What was under here? And more importantly, when had it been poured? Before my father bought the house or after? I stood up, looking for something to help me. Dad's tools were all around me. I found a hammer and a chisel and brought them back to the corner. Then I did something that, looking back, was probably insane. I started chipping away at the concrete. It was hard work. Concrete doesn't give easily, especially when it's been cured for years. But I was driven by something beyond logic now, some desperate need to understand what was happening in this house. I worked for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes, chipping and hammering, creating a small hole in the newer section of floor. The chisel finally broke through into empty space. I felt it punch through, meeting no resistance, and I nearly lost my balance. There was a hollow space under this floor. A space that someone had deliberately covered up. I made the hole bigger. Working frantically now, my nightgown soaked with sweat despite the basement's chill. When the opening was about a foot across, I stopped and grabbed my phone from my pocket. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it down into the hole. The light revealed a space about 3 feet deep, carved out of the earth beneath the house's foundation. And inside that space, covered in dirt and cobwebs and 40 years of darkness, were bones. Not human bones. I knew that immediately, and the relief was so powerful it made me dizzy. They were small, maybe from a dog or a cat. But there was something else down there too. A metal box, about the size of a shoebox, covered in rust and dirt. I should have waited. I should have stopped there, climbed the stairs, and pounded on that door until Richard woke up or morning came. Whichever happened first. But I didn't. I reached down into that hole, and pulled out the box. It was heavy, and the metal was cold against my palms. There was no lock, just a rusted latch that resisted for a moment before giving way with a squeal. Inside were papers. Documents that had been protected from the damp by a plastic bag, now yellowed and brittle but still readable. I pulled them out carefully and spread them on the floor beside me. And as I read them by the light of my phone, the whole terrible story finally came together. The top document was a death certificate for Dorothy Marie Anderson, dated September 18, 1952. Cause of death: broken neck and head trauma, consistent with a fall. But someone had written on this copy, in blue ink that had faded to almost nothing. For words. It wasn't an accident. Under that was a letter, written in a shaky hand on lined notebook paper. It was dated November 1952, 2 months after Dorothy's death. The handwriting was barely legible, but I could make it out. To whoever finds this, my name is Robert Anderson and I am a murderer. I killed my wife Dorothy in September. She found out about Sarah, the woman I'd been seeing in secret. We fought at the top of the basement stairs. I didn't mean to push her. I swear to God I didn't mean to do it. But she fell and she died, and I let everyone believe it was an accident. I can't live with this anymore. I can't sleep. I see her everywhere. I hear her crying in the basement every night. She won't let me rest. By the time someone reads this, I'll be dead too. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. God help me. Robert Anderson. But Robert Anderson hadn't died. I knew that from the newspaper articles. He'd sold the house and moved away. So why was this confession buried in the basement? Had he written it and then lost his nerve? Hidden it here and run instead? There was one more document in the box. A receipt from a concrete company, dated April 1978. For work done at this address. Pouring a new section of basement floor, 3 by 4 feet. April 1978. The same month my father bought this house. And suddenly, horribly, I understood. My father had found this box. He'd found Robert Anderson's confession, probably hidden in the basement when he first moved in. And instead of going to the police, instead of exposing a decades-old murder, he'd covered it up. Literally. He'd poured new concrete over it, buried the evidence, and kept the secret for 47 years. But why? Why would he do that? The answer came to me slowly, like dawn breaking. Patricia Holloway. The woman Dad had loved in secret. The woman he'd been planning to leave with. What if she wasn't just some woman? What if she was Sarah? The Sarah from Robert Anderson's confession. The woman he'd been having an affair with when he killed his wife? If Patricia Holloway was Sarah, then she'd been involved in Dorothy's death, even if indirectly. And if Dad had fallen in love with her, if he'd learned her secret and decided to protect her anyway, then that would explain everything. The buried confession. His refusal to sell the house, because selling it meant someone else might find what he'd hidden. His secretive relationship with Patricia, because how could he explain to his children that he was in love with a woman connected to a murder? And it would explain why Dorothy's spirit, if that's what was locking the door, was so desperate to be heard. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was trying to tell me the truth. The truth my father had buried literally and figuratively, to protect the woman he loved. I sat on that cold basement floor with a dead woman's bones and a confession to murder. And I started to cry. Not for Dorothy, though God knows she deserved my tears. Not even for the terrible choice my father had made. I cried for myself, for the loss of the man I thought I knew. My father had been good and kind and honest, or so I'd always believed. But he'd also been human. Capable of choosing love over justice. Capable of keeping terrible secrets. The basement door unlocked with a click so loud it made me jump. I looked up at the stairs and saw the bolt slide back, completely on its own, metal moving against metal with no hand touching it. The door swung open slowly, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I'd been shown what I needed to see. Now the question was, what was I going to do about it? Morning came eventually, the way it always does. Even after the worst nights of your life. I climbed those basement stairs at dawn carrying Robert Anderson's confession box, my knees aching and my mind churning with impossible decisions. Richard found me in the kitchen an hour later, sitting at the table with cold coffee, and that rusted metal box in front of me. Maggie. He stood in the doorway in his robe, his white hair standing up in all directions. I woke up and you weren't there. Are you all right? I looked at him, at this good man who'd been my partner for 51 years. And I didn't know how to begin. So I just pushed the box toward him. You should read what's inside. It took him 20 minutes to go through everything. I watched his face change as he read. Saw the confusion turn to disbelief. Then horror. Then something that looked like grief. When he finished, he set the papers down very carefully, like they might explode. Where did you find this? So I told him about being locked in the basement, about the section of newer concrete, about everything I'd pieced together in those dark hours. I told him my theory about Patricia Holloway being the Sarah from the confession. I told him what I thought Dad had done and why. Richard listened without interrupting, and when I finished he was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "What do you want to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What I wanted to do. Not what I should do. Not what was right or legal or proper. Just what I wanted. I don't know, I admitted. Dorothy Anderson deserves justice. But everyone involved is dead now. Robert Anderson disappeared 70 years ago. If Patricia Holloway is Sarah, she'd be in her 90s now, if she's even still alive. Dad's gone. What would justice even look like at this point? You could go to the police, Richard said. Give them the confession. Let them handle it. And they'd investigate. They'd dig into Dad's connection to all of this. They'd want to know why he hid evidence of a murder. His name would be dragged through the mud. Everything people thought they knew about him would change. I pressed my hands against my eyes. I can't do that to his memory. I can't do it to Claire and David. So you're thinking about burying it again? Keeping Dad's secret? I'm thinking about all the ways this could hurt people who are still alive. People I love. I looked at the box. But I'm also thinking about Dorothy. She's been trying to tell someone what happened for 70 years. Doesn't she deserve to be heard? That's when Richard said something that changed everything. Have you tried to find Patricia Holloway? If she's still alive, maybe she deserves a chance to tell her side of things too, before you decide what to do with that box. It was a good point. I'd been making assumptions about Patricia based on circumstantial evidence. and one man's guilt-ridden confession written in the dark of night. Maybe there was more to the story. Maybe Sarah and Patricia weren't even the same person. I spent that morning on the internet, searching for Patricia Holloway. It took less time than I expected. She wasn't hard to find. She was 89 years old and lived in an assisted living facility in South Portland, just 20 minutes from our house. And according to her online obituary preview, ready to be published, her maiden name had been Sarah Patricia Holloway. She'd gone by her middle name since childhood. Sarah. It was her. I didn't tell Richard the first was going to see her. I just got dressed, got in my car, and drove to Harborview Assisted Living before I could change my mind. The facility was nice, one of those places that tries hard not to look institutional, with plants everywhere and watercolor paintings on the walls. I told the front desk I was an old friend of Patricia's, and they directed me to her room on the second floor. I knocked on her door, my heart pounding. A weak voice called, "Come in." Patricia Holloway sat in a wheelchair by the window, looking out at the parking lot. She was tiny, shrunken by age, her white hair thin and wispy. But when she turned to look at me, her eyes were sharp and bright blue. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I saw recognition dawn on her face. "You're Margaret," she said. "Robert's daughter." "How did you know?" "You have his eyes. I'd know them anywhere." She gestured to a chair. "Sit down. I've been wondering if you'd come." I sat, that rusted box heavy in my lap. "You knew I'd find out about you? I hoped you would. After Robert died, I thought maybe someone would go through his things and find my letters. I wanted his children to know he hadn't been alone at the end, that he'd been loved." She smiled sadly. "Though I suppose the truth is more complicated than that." "You're Sarah," I said. It wasn't a question. The smile faded from her face. I was Sarah. A long time ago. Before I became Patricia again. Before I tried to build a different life. Robert must have told you. He didn't tell me anything. He died keeping your secret. I set the box on the table between us. But Dorothy told me. In her way. Patricia's hands, twisted with arthritis, reached for the box but didn't quite touch it. "You found Robert Anderson's confession. I always wondered where he'd hidden it." "You knew about it?" "He showed it to me once years ago. Said he'd written it in a moment of clarity after Dorothy died, planning to turn himself in. But he couldn't do it. He ran instead. And he's been running his whole life, even after he changed his name." She looked at me. "You didn't know? Robert Anderson and Robert Walsh weren't just coincidentally the same first name. Your father was Robert Anderson." The room tilted. I gripped the arms of my chair. "That's impossible. My father was Robert Walsh. Born in New York. I've seen his birth certificate. Created in 1953, along with a whole new identity. It wasn't as hard to disappear back then as it is now. He became Robert Walsh, moved across the country, built a new life. Met your mother. Had children. And he never ever went back to Maine until 1978, when he bought that house. Why would he buy the house where he killed his wife? That's insane. Because he couldn't leave her behind. Dorothy haunted him, Margaret. Not just in his dreams. She was actually there, in that house, trying to be heard. He told me once that buying the house was the only way to make sure no one else would find what he'd hidden. But I think the real truth was that he needed to be close to her. To ask her forgiveness every day for what he'd done. I felt sick. My father. My kind, gentle father who'd taught me to ride a bike and walked me down the aisle and held his grandchildren with such tenderness. He'd killed his first wife and spent his whole life hiding it. "And you?" I asked. "You were having an affair with him when Dorothy died. Were you involved?" "I loved him," Patricia said simply. "I was 26 years old, and he was 32, and we were both lonely and stupid. His wife knew something was wrong, but she didn't know about me specifically. The night she died, Robert and I were supposed to run away together. He was going to tell her that evening, ask for a divorce. But something went wrong. They fought. And she fell. Or he pushed her. I don't know. I'll never know. Robert said it was an accident, that he reached for her and she stepped back and lost her balance. But I've lived long enough to know that accident is what guilty people tell themselves so they can sleep at night." She looked at her hands. "I was supposed to meet him that night. When he didn't show up, I knew something terrible had happened. I left town 2 days later and never came back. Changed my first name to Patricia, moved to Chicago, built a whole different life. Until Dad found you again. Until Robert found me again, yes. 3 years ago. He tracked me down somehow, showed up at my door after 65 years, and asked if I could ever forgive him. If we could start over, two old people who'd made terrible mistakes when they were young. And you said yes. I loved him. Her voice broke. I never stopped loving him, even though I should have. Even though what we did was unforgivable. We were planning to leave together, to spend whatever time we had left somewhere Dorothy couldn't find us. But his heart gave out before we could go. I sat there absorbing this, trying to reconcile the story she was telling with the father I'd known. The basement door, I finally said. It locks itself every night. Dorothy's trying to keep people out. Or keep Robert in. Keep him there with her, in the place where she died. Even after death, she wouldn't let him go. Patricia leaned forward. What are you going to do, Margaret? With that confession? With what you know? I looked at the box. At this evidence of a 70-year-old crime. At the proof that my father had been someone completely different from who I'd thought. Everyone involved is dead or dying. What would justice accomplish now? It would give Dorothy a voice. It would make what happened to her real, not just a tragic accident that people forgot about. But it would destroy my father's memory, hurt my children. And you, it would implicate you too. I'm 89 years old and I have stage 4 cancer, Patricia said. I'll be lucky to see Christmas. Do what you need to do. I'm not afraid anymore. I stayed there for another hour, listening to Patricia tell me about my father's other life. About Robert Anderson, the man he'd been before he became Robert Walsh. Some of it was hard to hear. But some of it was beautiful too. The way he'd tried to become better. The way he'd carried his guilt like a weight for 70 years. The way he'd loved my mother genuinely. Even though he'd never been able to forget his first wife. When I left, I took the box with me. But I also took something else. An understanding that people are complicated. That good people can do terrible things. That love and guilt and fear can make us into liars and cowards and occasionally, when we're lucky, into something better than what we were. I went home and found Richard in the garden. I told him everything Patricia had told me. And then I told him what I'd decided. That night, we went down to the basement together. We brought the box, the confession, and Dorothy's death certificate. We stood in front of that section of newer concrete, and I spoke to the empty air. Dorothy, I said. I know what happened to you. I know it wasn't an accident. I know Robert Anderson killed you and ran away and lived his whole life as someone else. And I know that's not fair. I know you deserve justice and peace and all the years that were stolen from you. The basement was quiet, but I felt something. A presence listening. I can't give you legal justice. Everyone who hurt you is gone now, or will be soon. But I can give you this. I can tell your story. I can make sure people know what happened. That your death wasn't an accident. That you were murdered by a man who spent 70 years running from what he did. I opened the box and took out Robert Anderson's confession. I read it aloud, every word in that cold basement. And when I finished, something remarkable happened. The temperature in the room changed. The oppressive feeling, that sense of being watched and judged, lifted. The air felt lighter. The next morning, I contacted a reporter at the Portland Press Herald. I told her I had information about a cold case from 1952. I gave her copies of everything except the part about my father being Robert Anderson. I told her I'd found the confession in my late father's house. That he must have discovered it when he bought the property, and didn't know what to do with it. I said I was coming forward now because Dorothy Anderson deserved to have her story known. The article ran 2 weeks later. Murder confession surfaces in 70-year-old cold case. It told Dorothy's story. It named Robert Anderson as her killer. It sparked a small investigation, though of course there was nothing to investigate at this point. But people knew. Dorothy's death was acknowledged as a murder, not an accident. Her name was remembered. Patricia Holloway died 3 weeks after the article ran. I went to her funeral. I was the only person there besides the funeral home staff. She'd outlived everyone who'd known her. I stood by her grave and wondered if she and my father and Dorothy had found some kind of peace together, wherever they were now. As for the basement door, it never locked itself again. Whatever Dorothy needed to tell me, I'd finally heard. Whatever she needed from this house, she'd received. The presence that had been there, demanding attention, demanding justice, was gone. Richard and I still live in Dad's house. We talk sometimes about what we learned, about the man my father really was. I've made peace with it, mostly. He was a murderer and a liar. He was also a good father who loved his children and tried every day to be better than what he'd been. Both things can be true. I think about Dorothy often. About the young woman who carved her initials into the underside of those stairs, who never got to grow old or have children or make the same mistakes we all make. I think about how she was erased, turned into a footnote, a tragic accident that people forgot about. And I'm glad that I could give her a voice, even 70 years too late. Some stories need to be told. Some secrets need to be spoken. And sometimes, the dead need the living to bear witness to what happened to them. To say their names and acknowledge their existence and their pain. That's what I did for Dorothy Anderson. And in doing it, I learned more about my father than I ever wanted to know, but maybe needed to understand. We're all complicated. We all carry secrets. And love, real love, sometimes means forgiving people for being human, for being flawed, for being exactly what they always were, even if we never saw it. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. Thank you for listening to an old woman work through the hardest thing she's ever had to face. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the secrets in your own family or the complicated people you love, I hope you'll like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, more truth that's messy and hard and real. Tell me in the comments where you're from. Tell me if you've ever discovered something about your family that changed how you saw everything. Tell me your stories. Because that's what we do, isn't it? We tell our stories to each other. We bear witness. We remember. We try to understand. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find a way to forgive.